Service and OSD research activities are complementary, coordinated, and aligned with their unique capabilities and missions. For example, the Army is updating and expanding the DoD climate assessment tool for improved forecasting of operational risks to our infrastructure. The Navy is exploring new platforms for sustained observations in the Arctic. They're also developing global weather, ocean, and ice sea prediction models. The Navy and Air Force collaborate with interagency partners on the National Earth System Prediction Capability, which is the next generation of predictive models. The Air Force leverages national and allied partners' seasonal and climate model projections to provide planning products for the DoD and for the intelligence community. The Office of the Secretary of Defense's Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program is identifying new approaches for ensuring infrastructure resilience to the changing climate. The Test Resource Management Center actively monitors potential impacts from weather and natural events at our test ranges. The Department's interagency and international partners are central to our work. We are engaged in a number of interagency committees through the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, such as the Subcommittee on Global Change Research. As a result of our engagement, DoD benefits from the significant R&D investments across the federal government related to the changing climate. These committees also support international coordination and collaboration. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Nikolic. I want to thank all of our witnesses for your opening statements. We're going to now move to questions, but before I do, I ask unanimous consent that non-subcommittee members be allowed to participate in today's briefing. After all subcommittee members have had the opportunity to ask questions. Is there any objection? Without objection, non-subcommittee members will therefore be recognized at the appropriate time for 5 minutes. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for opening questions, and will recognize members in the order of seniority according to their appearance before the subcommittee. Ms. Langen, Rieckhoff, and Mr. Tipton, I'd like to refer back to this year's Worldwide Threat Assessment and the quote that global environmental degradation as well as climate change are likely to fuel competition for resources, economic distress, and social discontent through 2019 and beyond. First of all, do you agree with the administration's Worldwide Threat Assessment? And also I want to say that if you agree, then what regions of the world should we be watching most closely for climate change-driven instability?
Chairman, thank you for that question. As the National Intelligence Council takes lead with the Worldwide Threat Testimony, and my unit actually has responsibility for the climate analysis that goes into it. So we just very recently have been looking at last year's testimony as we prepare for next year's testimony, and we continue to agree with that analytic assessment. There are a range of places to look at as far as where we might see climate stresses that could lead to some type of conflict. One place, or one type of area in particular, will be areas where there are potential water conflicts or water disputes. And to date, water has not led to as a single cause for any conflict between two nations. That said, as we move forward and there are increasing droughts and there are increasing strains on water resources which supply more than one nation, I think those are areas that we need to be watchful for. Those are in particular in the Middle East, Northern Africa, as well as in South Asia, where areas have experienced extreme drought. Water supplies are going to be challenging going forward, and we already are seeing that those are areas where that could be an area of increasing tension. That's just one example.
Thank you. Thank you. Mr. Tipton?
Mr. Chairman, thank you. We agree with Maria's characterization of the problem. Some of the specific areas that we pay attention to that we know are potential hotspots are sub-Saharan Africa, where they're particularly vulnerable to climate variability, where droughts, floods, cyclones, desertification can cause potentially agricultural yield losses up to more than 20%. So we fully support and concur with Dr. Langenreikoff's assessment and monitor the same areas. Russian impact on water supplies going into Crimea. There are a variety of areas around the world, South Asia, that we pay attention to, but we really take the lead from the IC in helping us understand those global strategic implications.
Thank you. I guess maybe to dive in just a little further, the assessment also states that heat waves, droughts, and floods combined with poor governance practices are increasing water and food insecurity in the world. The assessment specifically mentions Egypt, Ethiopia, Iraq, and Jordan. Can you discuss further implications of social unrest, migration, and interstate tension within these nations? Anything else you want to expand upon?
I think it's important to remember when we think about the causes of conflicts or internal instability that for almost any of the ones we're talking about, it's hard to narrow it down to a monocause. It's compounding strains. Climate, extreme weather events often tend to be that threat multiplier in these cases. But for a decade now, we have been watching some of the implications of extended drought in the Middle East. We've had 5 years of drought conditions in Central America, which has challenged agricultural production. So again, I'm going back to water issues, but when communities are strained by water, we see depleted crop production, we see issues of internal migration and families moving into urban areas, increasing the strain on cities and government provisions. And in countries where there are cases of corruption or poor government services, that just kind of ratchets up the possibility of greater instability.
Thank you. So, Ms. Langenreikoff and Mr. Mikado, the administration's worldwide threat assessment states also that diminishing Arctic Sea ice may increase competition, particularly with Russia and China, over access to sea routes and natural resources. I know you touched on this in your opening statements, but can you further characterize Russia and China's behavior in the Arctic? And moreover, in March, before the Senate Armed Services Committee, the EUCOM commander testified that operational plans had been changed to respond to Russian movement of weapon systems to exert influence over the Arctic. And I wanted to ask, are we postured to sufficiently to counter Russian moves to exert control over the region? Maybe we'll start with Mr. Mercado, and then we'll go.
Chairman, as I said in my opening statement, great power competition focused on Russia and China is of great concern for us. As we watch what Russia is doing, how they're modernizing their ports, putting missile systems, modernizing their airfields so they can base aircraft out of that, and how they are treating countries that want to transit the North Sea Passage, making them or demanding that they ask for permission, maybe use their icebreakers and elements like that. We are concerned. When we see China, who is not an Arctic nation, deploy research vessels up there, engage with various countries, not directly with the countries, but through other contacts. And based on my experience, looking now what their behavior brought us in the Pacific, in the Western Pacific, in the South China Sea, and their track record. So we are concerned with some of their activities up there. When we look at our posture in the Arctic, especially the Northern Warning Center that we have that's aging was built in the 50s. I know that us in Canada are looking at options, alternatives to modernize that, but not just for that warning piece, but also all the future threats like hypersonics, missiles, and things like that. So the Arctic has the attention of both the Northcom commander, General O'Shaughnessy, as well as the EUCOM commander, General Walters. And we always do our planning by doing intelligence assessment of the environment. So we update all our plans based on the environment and how that could change, the intel assessment, and then adjust our plans accordingly, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Mikado. Ms. Onion-Rikoff, do you want to comment, please?
Well, I agree with Mr. Mercado's statements. I think we need to remember that Russia views the Arctic as an essential element of its national sovereignty. Just looking at its coastland, Russia's total Arctic coastline is 24,000 kilometers. And we have watched Moscow seeking to project greater influence in the Arctic through many of the things Mr. Mercado mentioned: infrastructure development, refurbishing its military facilities, training deployments. Russia is concerned about foreign influence. It is investing and increasing its commercial activities as sea ice declines. So yes, this is an area of concentration for the Russians.
Okay, thank you. The ranking member is not recognized.
Thank you. The department has recently increased training activities in the Arctic or near Arctic environments with exercises like Trident Juncture. What impact have these exercises and the development of an Arctic strategy had on the department's operational concept development? And what does the department plan on doing differently? And broadly, how does OSD integrate climate science and policy into the development of our military policy? Mr. Mikado, I'll ask that to you.
Thank you, Ranking Member. I think Trident Juncture, along with a number of activities that we embarked since the Arctic Strategy, as we get into implementation, and part of that implementation is enhancing our Arctic operations. And an example of that is just last month, where the Second Fleet deployed a maritime ops center to Iceland, and then deployed 4 ships up there, and we are learning. There's nothing like taking ships in a very harsh climate and learn the impact to all our weapon systems, the communications up at that area of latitude, and then also the resiliency we have for our sailors in that environment. And if you look on the other coast, where up in Alaska, we do a number of training events, again, to understand the effects of the cold, harsh climate on our operations. So I think since the Arctic Strategy, we have made a concerted effort to learn and assess our gaps in our training, and we'll also learn from our allies and partners as well, who have much more experience and expertise in operating in that climate.
I would be remiss if I didn't add, you mentioned Alaska, but one of the most effective and useful cold weather training facilities is at Fort Drum in my district, where we have significant capabilities and are able to develop that skill set that is going to be an issue that we have to tackle as we look to the Arctic. I yield the balance of my time to Mr. Gallagher.
Thank you. Mr. Mercado, we've seen public reporting that China is pursuing small-scale floating nuclear reactors to support the artificial island bases in the South China Sea. Is DoD aware and tracking those developments?
I am not familiar with that specific report. I am tracking some of the nuclear efforts of Russia in the Arctic, but I am not aware of that specific report in the South China Sea.
Interesting. Where, I guess then more broadly, where does DoD stand in terms of developing similar technology, nuclear microreactors? Basically, the idea is that, particularly in permanent bases, given the vulnerabilities inherent to the grid, vulnerabilities for cyber attack, that it would make sense to develop an alternative source of energy, and that there's promising technology in the pipeline right now. I'd just be curious, anyone on the panel take a swing where we stand on developing that technology relative to our competitors, China and Russia in particular.
Yes, sir, let me respond to that. So the department is looking at technologies having to do with what we call microreactors in 2 formats, one of which is to serve as an energy source for our fixed locations where there are challenges to normal provision of electricity and energy. And those instances where a transportable capability might have application in operational settings. And so we're looking at both of those, and both in terms of exploring the technologies and considering applications.
What can we do in Congress to help expedite that process? I mean, the risk is that the Chinese gain a market advantage in these technologies. We've seen some of the capital from the private sector going to China, actually, and that we may not be able to catch up. Are there things here we can do in Congress to help DoD explore those options more expeditiously?
I would
Do
say
you think
that.
they're promising? I mean,
I beg your pardon?
do you think they're promising? I mean,
Yes. I think the thing that I would say is that in our pursuit of this, we're doing these activities in strong partnership with the Department of Energy. I think there's a general belief that this segment of capability could constitute a new area of revival for commercial providers, and so there are hopeful prospects in this area. I think probably the best I could say in terms of what we would ask is for the requests we put forward if they could be supported by the Congress.
thank you, and I thank the ranking member for her indulgence.
Mr. Garamendi is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the courtesy of joining you on this hearing. I believe all of us are aware of the work that this subcommittee has done over the last several years in addressing the climate change issue. Much of that work found its way into the Readiness Committee, MARC, and just quickly share some of what was put into the MARC, and I see some colleagues here who are aware of it. What we wanted to do in the MARC was to make sure that the 1,100 facilities that the Department of Defense MARC, actually, it's more than a MARC. It's going to be up for a vote this afternoon or this evening. At the Department of Defense and its 1,100 facilities take into account climate change and the impacts that it will have or could have from natural events, hurricanes, tornadoes, floods, deluges, whatever. Oh, rising sea level also. And so there's a requirement that the major bases have a master plan within the next 3 years to deal with this. And also, the Department of Defense will have limited authority, spending until there are plans that actually carry out climate resiliency. And so that'll be for all of the new MILCON programs. And then the structures themselves will be redesigned to the maximum energy conservation and resiliency for earthquakes or tornadoes or floods or whatever it happens to be. And we want to make sure, and this is a pilot program, and this may fit into what Mr. Gallagher just brought up, and that is energy sufficiency, microgrids, and energy conservation on all of the bases. And there will be $133 million special fund to carry out these projects. And finally, we expect there will be power outages. Welcome to California and PG&E and Southern California Edison. So there'll be black start up programs on key bases to test it, along with the microgrids that go with it. Much of what's been discussed here is also in the bill having to do with icebreakers. And again, this committee's played a major role. The first heavy icebreaker is in process of construction, early stages, design, and it's nearly complete in construction soon. But it's one of at least 4 that we need to deal with the challenges of the Arctic, which have been discussed here in some depth. Beyond that, we do know that we're going to have to deal with sea level rise. And it turns out that a lot of our bases are on the shore. We have considered 2 different options for the largest military shipyard in the world, Norfolk. One option is to figure out what seawalls might fit. The other is to outfit everybody with waders. One of those 2 things are going to have to be done because we're already seeing the sea level rise there. Beyond that, just down the line, what else should we be doing? And let's start with the design side of it and quickly, I don't know, 30 seconds apiece. What else should we be doing?
So I'd like to maybe bring out a few points about what we are doing in terms of basic research and understanding that can support the direction you're describing. I'd illustrate it maybe with a particular case. As we think about the receding of ice in the Arctic, we concern ourselves with the idea of thawing permafrost. And research that's going on having to do with an understanding of what that means in terms of our ability to support structures and their design, and along with that, how we might be able to instrument some of those, put instrumentation on some of those structures so that we can determine the onset of stresses that we could take steps to correct before catastrophic damage is affected.
Thank you.
Sir.
So, Mr. Garamendi, first, this is far beyond my area of expertise, but from the defense intel perspective, obviously we'll follow the lead of our partners in research engineering and A&S in terms of how we protect our intelligence capability systems, and buildings and installed capacity that we have around the world and in the United States. And we'll continue to work with the broader implications of those changes and what that means for the nations around the world and the implications then for us.
If I might interrupt quickly.
Sir.
Actually, you are going to be involved in some of this, some of your assets for anticipatory where the fires are going, where the flood might be. There are observation platforms that are available, and in the legislation this year, we do move those, make those assets available for climate-related challenges.
Sir, having watched the events where our bases have felt the extreme effects of weather, and also most of my time has been in the Pacific watching Guam take some severe hits time and time again, and us failing to improve the infrastructure and learn from that. This is hugely important. From my standpoint in strategy, plans, and capability, what we need to be able to do is to generate forces. So, and the key to generating our forces is our bases. And so to the degree that we can base, train, mobilize, operate, and generate those forces to where they need to be, it's hugely important. So all those things are much needed.
We'll be looking at the new construction projects on Guam specifically for that Category 5 typhoon.
For the intelligence community, over the past year, we have taken steps to increase intelligence sharing and collaboration across the IC and beyond. There's been the establishment of the Environmental Security Working Group in the spring of this year. It was sponsored by the NIC, the National Intelligence University, and the Civil Applications Committee to work across the community to share information, to make sure we're bringing in the most recent and scientific research on climate, and to look at the broad range of risks that affect all of the agencies and the whole of the U.S. government. That is a program that now is meeting monthly and is exploring the range of implications.
If I might, Mr. Chairman, final 30-second comment. The work that you did on your subcommittee has done in the previous years informed us that the Department of Defense is a major consumer of fossil fuels of all kinds. And as a result of your work in the NDAA, there will be encouragement for energy conservation on the bases, on the facilities, in the ships, planes, and so on and so forth. All of that to deal with the emissions issue. Really thank you, and thank you so very much for the time and the work that your committee has done over the many years. We'll continue to take your work and forward it into the readiness.
Absolutely. Thank you, Chairman Garamendi. I want to thank you for your leadership on the Readiness Subcommittee and the time and attention you've put into the climate change issue. And it's been great working with you, and particularly on the joint hearing that we held recently together between this subcommittee and the Readiness Subcommittee. So thank you for that. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Crow for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for joining us today on the important topic. Mr. Mercado, beginning with you, over the past several months, I've been holding roundtables with senior leaders from the Department of Defense and Department of Energy and outside experts to explore the importance and challenges associated with the effects of climate change on our operational capabilities and our installations. As the threat from extreme weather due to climate change continues to grow, we are asking our troops to fight in increasingly extreme environments. At the policy and planning level, how is the department adopting its strategy to reflect the changing environment that we are seeking our soldiers to operate in? And what additional authorities are necessary to adapt at the rate that we're seeing ourselves having to adapt?
Sir, I think we start with implementing the Arctic strategy that we developed and published. So it's one thing to develop a strategy, it's the other thing, the next step is to implement it. And from that, the ways we have identified to do that is to first build the awareness of not only the Arctic, but also trying to predict severe climate. Also enhancing our operations, like I said earlier, about increasing the operations that we conduct either in the Arctic or in other places with regard to, so we can learn and make our systems more resilient, not only the ones that are ashore, but also our ships and also our service members. And then the other part is much broader and applies to the Arctic and the Arctic strategy about working with our partners. Some of the partners, like I said earlier, have very large expertise in operating in these environments, and we can learn from them as we work to them to increase that skill set.
And a follow-on question for the whole group, whoever wants to chime in on this one. You represent various agencies, departments, but there's a lot of our government that has equities in the Arctic. Which of those are not represented here today that you think are relevant for this discussion? And do you have challenges with siloing? Are people kind of within agency silos, and are there things that Congress can do to help break down any barriers that might exist and increase collaboration across the federal government?
If you'd allow me, maybe to speak to one aspect of that, and that has to do in our research and technology area. We are participants in a number of committees under the White House's Office of Science and Technology Policy that are expressly designed to help foster our collaboration and sharing of information, knowledge, models, and all the rest across the interagency to the benefit of all executive branch members. It is worth pointing out that those are brought together actually as a statutory requirement. So as a result of action on the part of the Congress, those committees have come together.
And is that operating effectively in your view?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Very effectively.
Would the others like to chime in on that?
Not on that, Mr. Crow, not on that specific subject, but related to your question about siloing and breaking down of the barriers between some of the components. If you look at what's happened over the last 10 years within defense intel and the intelligence community, the changes that have been implemented in terms of forcing that integration across the various practitioners within those very broad enterprises have been very, very effective. Dr. Langen-Rakoff mentioned the ESWG, the Environmental Security Working Group. That's an example of a fairly new entity that brings together all these various components to cause to happen that information sharing that you need to have that collaborative effect and break down those stovepipes. So I think in a nutshell, we've made tremendous progress in enabling those cross flows of communication within the defense intel enterprise, the IC, and our relationship with academia, with all the other folks that have a role in this kind of activity.
Sir, the value of plans is it helps break down stovepipes. Like I said, planning starts with intel, preparation of the environment and the assessments. And then critical to planning, once you've developed that plan, is the posture associated with executing that plan, because the plan is no good unless the bases and the posture that you have in a region can support that. So that brings all of the other DoD components and all the services who have to execute the plans and all the training and force development and all that entails. So at least with the strategy and how we have a resurgence in planning in the department, I think that's helping to bring different parts of the department together.
I'm out of time, so Mr. Chair would yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Crow. We're going to do a second round, so if you have further questions, you'll be able to get them in then. Recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Nikolic, what modifications would we need to make for our forces to be able to operate in a newly opened Arctic? I know we've touched on some of this already, but what changes would we need to, modifications would we need to make? And are surface fleets capable of operating in sub-freezing waters, and do we have sufficient polar satellite coverage?
Let me respond in this way. With respect to operational capabilities, it's really outside my area of expertise, but I would say that with respect to developing the understanding to inform how we need to go about doing that and the capabilities that are necessary, the Navy is, of course, leading the way in getting gathering the necessary data to provide to go into our modeling capabilities to project what conditions we're likely to face, and in turn then provide a basis for determining specific capabilities. With respect to observational capabilities, I can't, beg your pardon, but I can't speak in particular depth, but I can say that two things are happening. First of which is we're drawing not only on our own capabilities and sensors that are being emplaced, but also drawing from the sensing capabilities within the civil component of our space capabilities. And through our partnerships, we can look for opportunities for our partners to collaborate in terms of providing data sources for our models.
Thank you. Any else, Dr. Mikado? Ms. Mikado, do you want to chime in about modifications that we need to make?
Well, yes, Chairman. I think based on the nature of the environment, much of the operations are conducted by the Air Force and also the submarines. As you know, we conduct ISEX there. So recently now, I'm interested to see the feedback from the Navy's efforts to start operating more in that environment. So I think we have much to learn on the surface side, but we have very good engineers that can adapt, like we've adapted to the dust in the Middle East. And as we operate more up in the Arctic, we'll learn more to make our surface force more resilient.
And so would this include additional expansion of a base and operating facilities?
Well, sir, part of the Arctic strategy talks about reviewing infrastructure required to project power and operate in the Arctic. So we have some work to do that assessment on the requirements for a strategic port up in Alaska or other places that will help enable those operations.
Very good. Thank you. With that, unless there's any other comment, I'll yield to the ranking member.
Great. One final question. Dr. Nikolic, while this isn't specifically a DoD issue, I did want to raise this for your awareness and get your feedback. We've heard from the commercial sensing industry about a concern about the development of 5G networks, especially those networks that will operate in similar bands to the same bands used by weather satellites to detect water vapor, potentially compromising weather forecasting. This might be for you or Mr. Mercado. Is this something that DoD is aware of, and are there any research efforts to mitigate this potential challenge?
I'm sorry, but I'm not knowledgeable on that specific topic, but that I'm not knowledgeable doesn't, off the top of my head, doesn't mean that we're not aware of it. So if you'll allow me, I'd prefer to take that for the record and give you a proper and thorough answer on that. Yeah.
Sure, I appreciate it. I will take that response for the record, look forward to it.
Yes,
Mr. Mercado, do you have anything to add?
Nothing other than that. I know that 5G is a concern, but we can take that question for the record.
Okay. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member. One final question I had, Ms. Langen-Rieckhoff and Mr. Mikado probably be the appropriate ones to address this, but could you please describe U.S. engagement with the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable, and what are the priorities that have been discussed, and are there participating nations concerned about expanding Chinese influence in the region? I know we've talked about Chinese influence in the region already, but anything else you want to expand upon there, but in particular the Arctic Security Forces Roundtable?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not familiar with that roundtable, but I can reiterate my concern about China's operations in the Arctic region. And what my main concern is, as I watch their activity, as we watch their activity, is to avoid another episode similar to the South China Sea. Because I would think that somewhere in the past, as China started to reclaim those features, we had an opportunity probably to check that behavior. So what I'm hoping is that we don't make the same mistake as we monitor China's activities in the Arctic.
Okay, thank you. Do you have anything to add, Ms. Langerikoff?
I would also have to take back that question on the security forces in the Arctic. I don't have any information on that, but we are closely tracking what China is doing in the Arctic, its commercial activities, its shipping activities, and also many of its public statements it's made about its Arctic policy as calling itself a near-Arctic state and introducing the Polar Silk Road and linking it to the Belt and Road Initiative. So we are following it closely. I don't have any specific information.
Okay. If you could look into that and get back to us, that would be helpful. Thank you. With that last question round, I'll just yield to Chairman Garamendi for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, we're not going to be very successful in the Arctic and probably anywhere else where there's an ocean unless we become a signatory to the law of the sea. It's a major problem that we have in the South China Sea. It's certainly going to be, and is today, and will be in the future, even a greater problem in the Arctic. For example, Russia is claiming everything to the North Pole and beyond. We have no pushback because we have no status, failing to be a signatory to the law of the sea. Secondly, for the near term, probably for the next decade, we will not be able to operate on the surface in the Arctic Ocean with naval ships, unless somebody starts putting heavy plate on one side or both sides of the ship. And so we're going to have to depend upon icebreakers, of which we only have one heavy. We'll have two heavy soon. We're going to have to deal with this. And for the Department of Defense, this is a major and very, very important budget item. You can talk forever, but until there are icebreakers or naval ships are built for ice, which nobody has planned yet, we're going to depend upon the icebreakers displaying American power in the Arctic. Finally, I don't know if there's any final here, but next point, climate refugees. It was spoken to earlier by the panel. The climate refugee issue is of profound importance. We see them today. We talk about this mostly in the Sahel of Africa, but the issue of immigration from Central America is very, very much a climate issue, and we're talking climate refugees along with violence. And so we're seeing this, and we need to plan for that, not just for the military, obviously for immigration issues here in the United States, but also for dealing with our military operating, as an example, in the Sahel of Africa. So those are issues. I'd love to have a comment on any of these subjects, law of the sea, what we're really going to be able to do for the next decade in the Arctic as a military power. And finally, you've already talked about climate and climate refugees. Any comments you'd like to make in the next 2 minutes?
Sir, on the law of the sea, it has been an issue, and in all the international forums that I've experienced with or been involved with, our partners bring it up and they challenge us. And what I tell them is that, yes, I mean, we are not a signatory, but always judge us by our actions. Judge us that we always abide by the law of the sea. All our forces do that. So while we understand that there are issues with us being a signatory, and it hasn't happened yet, but again, judge us by how we comport ourselves on the high seas, and that's the approach we have to take at this point. With regard to icebreakers, absolutely, in the department, we support and we need icebreakers. So we support the Coast Guard effort to build up the icebreaker fleet, and that would be helpful for our operations, sir.
Yield back.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Garamendi. I want to thank our witnesses again for your testimony here today. Again, I'll reiterate that I would have liked to have had the the most senior leadership here testifying. They originally said that you would be the best people to come and testify, but this is also a senior leadership policy issue that we are going to have to confront and deal with for the foreseeable future. And so the senior leaders at the department are going to have to become more expert on this issue and this topic themselves, as they are going to have to spend more and more time dealing with the effects of climate change, the consequences, and both in planning, operations, in mitigating the effects of climate change on our bases, on military planning. Again, the consequences of climate change worldwide as a result of, again, desertification or climate drought, where we might be asked to respond, again, on just a whole host of levels. So I hope in the near future that we'll have senior leadership here as well testifying on this topic, who themselves will be up to speed and expert in these topics as well. They're going to need to be going forward. So with that, I know members had some questions that have asked for information to be returned to us on the record. I'd ask that you respond to those questions expeditiously. And with that, I want to thank you again for your testimony and the work you're doing in this area and many others. With that, the subcommittee now stands adjourned.